Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Ana Maria Salazar. I appreciate all of you who've been joining us throughout the years. It's always, I always enjoy doing this show at the end of the year because I try to make sense what happened throughout the last 11 months and try to, I don't know, maybe describe where we will be in a couple of months. And in this case, it'll be 2025. Joining us today is Carlos Ramirez. He's been joining those of you who follow the show know he's been joining us throughout the years. And Carlos, this I think is a good point or a good moment to try to analyze this the legislative agenda of the new government. I mean, I think Claudia Sheinbaum has been in office, what, 3 months? And my understanding is she's had one of the most well, Morena's legislators have been very, very busy. I think I don't know if you could give a sense to our audience what how many bills have been passed and the long-term impact these bills will have on Mexico's economy, Mexico's governance, Mexico's democracy. So welcome to the show. Where do you want to start? Let's start with the numbers.
Sure. Thank you for having me, Ana Maria. Always a pleasure. So yeah, the past months, I mean, and all the 2024, but the past 3 months are probably the most, without probably, it is the most active legislative period of Mexican history. 15 constitutional reforms were approved by either both chambers or at least by one. Out of the 18 reforms that Lopez Obrador proposed, 13 of them have already been approved by at least two of the chambers. Claudia Sheinbaum proposed other constitutional reforms. So it is the most busy process we have ever seen. What are the consequences of all of this major legislative disruption? And this, I mean, we could actually argue that Mexico has rewritten its constitution in only 3 months. And it will have profound and certainly very significant implications both for the economy and for the Mexican democracy in the future. Obviously, the well-known reform by most is the judicial reform. It is a major overhaul of the judicial branch, and it basically, it translates, we will have an election on June 1st, 2025, in which Mexicans will vote for their ministers, Supreme Court ministers, and federal judges, and basically represents a complete and absolute change in the way the judicial branch has worked in Mexico for the past 30 years or so. The end game of this, we are going to have a judicial branch that is going to become much more politicized and certainly much closer to the government that we have seen at least since the major reform of 1994. So it is a major change. Also, there are implications for Mexican democracy with the disappearance of 7 autonomous institutions. That bill basically takes out the autonomy, the constitutional autonomy of the Competition Commission, the Telecom Commission, the energy regulators, the poverty institution that measures here in Mexico poverty, and the institution that basically allows Mexicans to know what the government is doing, the transparency institution in the country. Those institutions are gone. And in 2025, we will start to reshape the new institutions that will substitute them, but it will be entirely different institutional landscape. And finally, I would say and argue that out of the 13 reforms approved, there are also couple of them that have very significant economic implications, particularly the one that has to do with energy. Basically, Mexico approved a constitutional reform that provides more power to our two national energy companies, Pemex and CFE, to basically call the shots in the future and to have much more discretionary power on how to organize the market. So Claudia Sheinbaum will start 2025 with enormous power, discretionary power, probably the most powerful president we have ever seen, at least in the past 40 years, in terms of her capacity to reshape policy, to basically go on and take decisions from a policy standpoint. So yeah, that is, Ana Maria, what happened in the past months, of very significant changes.
But I guess the question mark, Carlos, is in trying to understand what's going to happen in 2025 is, were these good reforms? Were these bad reforms? What is the short-term impact and what is the long-term impact? And it just seems that, for example, when you talk about the um, the judicial reform, and regardless whether you think it's a good idea for judges to be elected or not, I just want to put that aside. The problem is the way this was done.
Yeah,
It was fast with a lot of mistakes. Still a lot of questions as to whether what the election of judges is going to look like. What are going to be the problems? I mean, elections, nationwide elections are always a very delicate matter in Mexico, simply because you have to make sure that there are no extraneous influence out from outside Mexico, within Mexico, organized crime, you know, uh, big companies. I mean, there's always this sense that there can be, it's very easy, quote unquote, to steal the elections. Now, when you talk about judges, you're basically placing people who are going to be making very serious decisions about every day, our lives, any citizen, any Mexican citizen, or any company in Mexico. And it's not clear to me that there's going to be the infrastructure, the knowledge for these new judges, magistrates, and justices to be able to exercise their job in a way that people will trust the justice system. So, there's a lot of analysis, and I've spoken to a couple of experts about this, that there's going to be a total collapse of the
yeah,
judicial system that could last 1 or 2 years. So that is just one example.
yeah,
Um, there is, and we'll talk in a couple of minutes about the other reforms that will be taking place in the next couple of weeks that will probably be approved. I'm thinking of the Infonavit um, reform.
yeah.
But it just kind of goes back to all these reforms took place in haste, and I guess the question is, now what? What does the implementation of these reforms look like as of the beginning of 2025?
Yeah. So the main purpose and goal of this major constitutional overhaul in Mexico was, since day one, February 5th, the day that President Lopez Obrador presented the 18 constitutional reforms, it was very clear, Ana Maria. It was a reforms done with a goal of concentrating power in the hands of the executive and basically granting back, in a way, to the government and to the Mexican state more discretionary power in how to shape policy in the future. So it has profound implications in terms of our democracy, because it clearly will take us back probably 40 years, in the sense of going back to a very powerful president with very few checks and balances and highly discretionary power to basically do whatever she wants to do. And it takes us back to the PRI old times, in which the president had a lot of power. So the short-term implications in terms of its, let's say, the application of the reforms, I think it's going to be very disruptive. I think the judicial reform, I agree with what you just said. It's going to be a mess. It's going to be an election that is going to be very difficult for the National Electoral Institute to organize. They actually cut half of their budget for organizing the election. So we will not have a normal election as the one that we are accustomed here in Mexico. We will have election booths. So we will go not to a house close to our house to vote, but we will have to move to a collective place where a lot of people will go and vote. People will not know who to vote for. A lot of names will be in the ballot. So basically, we are going to have very high abstentionism. And the end game will be judges and ministers that are going to be selected not by their capacity and knowledge, but by their, in somewhere or another, capacity to be close to the power, to the current administration. So, I mean, it's going to be disruptive in the short term. The organization, the process of implementing the secondary reforms of all the constitutional reforms approved, the energy, the housing reform, the one that has to do with trains, the one that has to do with minimum wage. It's going to be very disruptive. And in the medium and long term, the consequences are more concentration of power in the hands of the executive, less checks and balances, more discretionary power for the president in terms of policy decision making. And most likely, I think it's going to have a toll in terms of the legal branch being less reliable as a source of basically granting rights for people to, that have disputes either with the state or that have disputes among them. So it's going to be a judicial branch less reliable and closer to the government than we've had during the past 30 years.
So, I mean, this is this is a tough question, but I've been asking this question because I'm trying to understand what is the end game. I like that phrase. What is the end game? I mean, what is the ultimate goal of all of this? Why these reforms? And I think you correctly said the reforms. The objective is the concentration of power. Okay,
Yeah.
but why the concentration of power? Because you are, what do you want to do with that power? Does the president, does Manuel think he is going to be able to continue controlling the country? His kids will become president? Do we really think that Morena is a party that can stay in power for the next 25 years or the next 50 years, like, or 60, 80 years, like the PRI? Or is it just that, it's a system by which you can favor those who support you and you will be benefit in economic terms? Because I'm just trying to think, what does this look like in terms of a vision that
Yeah.
is very different than the vision that Mexico had by the last 5 or 6 presidents,
Yeah.
which was a vision that you need to get closer to the United States, you need to open markets, you need to figure out ways that Mexico's more competitive, and maybe, there will be more employment, there will be more development. Maybe that's going to be the way to reduce inequality and poverty. Do you understand what I mean? I don't know what their end game is, because it seems that this is going to just be a big, huge fiasco.
Yeah. Very good question. And I would say a combination of what you just mentioned. First of all, definitely for Lopez Obrador, for Morena, for Claudia Sheinbaum, all these reforms is an opportunity to concentrate power, have more discretionary decision making, and at the end of the day, remain in power for decades. Because, by the way, one of the reforms that will come in 2025 will be electoral reform. And that reform, which was proposed originally by Lopez Obrador, basically they decided to wait for a while because they wanted the National Electoral Institute to organize the judicial election. But after that, they will change the electoral laws. They have a constitutional majority in Congress. They can do it any day. So the first point is, yes, they are thinking about remaining in power for the next 30 or 40 years, or making it very difficult to have alternation of power in the coming decades. First point. Second point, there is a redistribution objective. The administration and Sheinbaum and Lopez Obrador believe that they can basically redistribute income with their policies. So how? Concentrating more power, having more discretionary power, and basically calling the shots. And saying to the private sector, yes, you can participate in this, but with our own rules. And at the same time, social programs, minimum wage, labor reforms. So yeah, there is also a goal of redistributing income. We could obviously discuss if that is likely or not to happen, or if this is sustainable or not, but that is a goal in itself. And yeah, and a third very clear goal is Sheinbaum believes that the state, the Mexican state, she is highly influenced by the view that we can replicate what China has done or what the East Asian countries did in the past, Korea or Japan or Taiwan, or this view that the state can be the driver of development. They are not thinking about economic growth in itself. They are thinking about development, which includes redistribution. She believes that. She thinks that having a strong state with a strong hand is going to make it possible for Mexico to basically overcome its structural obstacles, to grow more and to have better social results. So the three of them: democracy, wipe out the possibility of alternation in the power, at least for the next decade. Second, more discretionary power in policy making. And yeah, bringing your friends into the process, by the way, which you mentioned also. And third, definitely redistribution with a stronger hand of the state in the economy.
So I guess the question is, if it, and assuming that is their view,
Yeah.
but also understanding that, Morena as a movement is very fragile.
Yes, it
And
is.
we've
Mhm.
seen it in the last, just in the last week and a half of the infighting between the heads of the Senate and the head of the lower house. And we're not going to go into details much. A lot of reporting has been done about that. But the fact that in order for this movement to survive, they really need to they coalesce into and decide that this is that they all agree that they have the same views or the same vision of how Mexico should progress in the next decades.
Yeah.
The question then you have to raise is, how effective is that going to be? I and that's, and it's a hard question to answer because on the one hand, Morena is absolutely right that they had that the poverty rates in Mexico and the inequality in Mexico is just not acceptable.
Yeah.
And also the corruption, which was the other platform that was very, very important for Andres Manuel when he had, as he campaigned through the last 20 years,
Yeah.
was unacceptable. But I'm looking at these programs and I'm just looking at the chaos that there's going to be and how the markets and how analysts are viewing the future of Mexico. I just, it just kind of raises the question, and of course the security situation. It
Yeah.
just raises a question: what is 2025 going to look like?
It's not going to look good, right? It's going to be a very challenging year, both domestically and also because of international factors. But only speaking about the domestic factors, it's going to be a year of disruption. This was a year of Disruption in the sense of all reforms being approved because after the result of the election. But now comes the implementation process, which no one knows exactly how is it going to look like and how we will end up in 2025, in December 20th of 2025. How is this country going to look like? We are in an economic slowdown. Clearly, the growth rate is coming down. There is a lot of expectation that next year we could eventually fall into a recession. As you mentioned, the security situation is becoming tougher. Clearly the U.S.-Mexico relation is going to be a very tough challenge for Sheinbaum. So yes, it's going to be a very big year because we are starting just to implement all these reforms, and really the government seems to think that it's going to be no big major issue. If you are sitting in the other side in the private sector, I am sure that all companies, sectors, and I would say that probably a lot of consumers are worried about next year. Sorry, cannot hear you.
Yes. One last question, Carlos, and I really appreciate Carlos Ramirez joining us today. Um, what what should we expect the first couple of weeks of January? Because I know there's some legislation that still needs to be approved, or
Yeah,
at least their goal is to approve it. So could you just kind of rapidly describe what are the expectations
yeah.
of these reforms?
So the formal legislative uh, first period of 2025 begins on February the 1st. However, it is very likely that the government will start early January discussing one reform that has to do with housing, which are, by the way, secondary laws of the constitutional reform approved a couple months ago on housing, which grants the housing mortgage institution in Mexico, which is um, a public institution in the sense that belongs to the government, grants this institution the possibility of building housing again after 30 years of not doing it. So it has caused a lot of concern on what are the potential implications of this. So that is going to be discussed in early January. Probably we'll see the secondary laws in energy, which are going to be very important for the private sector. The signals that come out of that are going to be very significant for the private sector. People are expecting to know the details on what is coming in the secondary laws. No one knows. And also, I would say that Sheinbaum has to present the so-called Mexico plan, which is the plan that Mexico has that has to do with relocation, right? Nearshoring, the nearshoring strategy, but also the strategy of substituting imports from China. So they're going to put them together in a single plan, and that will be presented probably in the month of January before the regular legislative process begins in February. Sorry, cannot hear you again.
So that's I'm laughing because it's just as I'm listening to you, it's just like, oh, there's just two or three things left. But the truth of the matter is, a lot is still. I mean, this reform on the housing reform is a huge deal. And I know, well, why don't we wait until see what happens in January to talk about the impact that's going to have, not only on the housing market, but also on workers' rights to
Absolutely.
have access to these funds that are taken out of their paycheck every month or every 15 days, as a way of guaranteeing housing for Mexican workers. I mean, that's what the concern is. What is the
Exactly.
government's plans to do with those funds? Anyway,
Yeah.
Carlos, I really appreciate you joining us today. Do you have any last words, any last thoughts that you'd like to share with our audience?
I think we've covered a lot of ground, but yes, definitely 2025 is looking to be one of the most challenging years for Mexican economy and Mexican politics of a long time.
Yeah. I couldn't agree with you more. And we're going to be talking about this in
Absolutely.
2025. Thank you. Thank you, Carlos Ramirez from Integralia. Thank you so much for joining us here and living in Mexico. We're gonna go to commercial break. I'm Ana Maria Salazar. Thank you. We'll be right back.